Hey, thanks so much for joining us here at Harvest Online. We'd love for you to go and like our pages on Facebook and Instagram. Follow us, harvest.247, and also go to YouTube, harvest.247 there. We'd love for you to subscribe to our channel. And you also go to harvest247.org, and you can check out anything about our Harvest Homes, or our mission, our beliefs, all of those types of things, core values. We'd love for you to check us out, follow us, and just let you know that Harvest Church exists so that all people may know Jesus and grow with Him. We're in the last sermon of our series, Under Pressure, and we are going through this series to talk about all the different types of pressures that we live under. We live under theological pressures, societal pressures, government pressures, all kinds of things now. And it's one of those things that asks the question, as a people who follow Jesus, or someone who may want to follow Jesus, how do we live in the midst of all of these pressures? And so that's why we've done this short little series to look at 4 people from the Old Testament and their various pressures that they lived under, and to try to glean something for us in our life. I loved to hike 14,000-foot mountains in Colorado, and one time we went to hike Mount Evans, and Mount Evans connected to another 14,000-foot mountain called Mount Bierstadt. Now, the thing about Mount Evans is, if you really wanted to, you could just drive up, hike about 200 feet, and then be at the top. But that doesn't count really in mountaineering. And there was another trail as well, but that trail doesn't count because you have to scale 3,000 vertical feet to be able to count the mountain in mountaineering. So the only option to be able to count Mount Evans was to go on a different trail that connected with another mountain. Instead, though, you have to go off trail. So we start on a trail to Mount Bierstadt, which we had hiked 8 times before, and then all of a sudden we break off into this kind of bush willow area. It's wet, it's marshy, there are moose that live in there, and we actually saw one, but you have to trek through this not undefined area to try to get around one part of the mountain so that you can then walk up and then walk across and then walk up again. And so it's one of those things where it sounds like a great idea until you're in the middle of it. And when you get in the middle of it and your legs are getting kind of cut a little bit, you are damp from brushing up against the willows, you're trying to trail find, you find yourself in moose territory and kind of coming face to face with a woman moose, and you're doing all those types of things. You're like, man, was this really a good idea? And a lot of times it's not that way. You get in the middle of something that you thought was going to be a good idea, and you're like, we shouldn't have done this. Well, that was the way Mount Evans was. Now, to finish the story, so everybody knows, we made our way up to Mount Evans, and we went back, got lost in the woods, and then finally found our trail again and got out of there. It was a great hike at the end of the story, but in the middle of it, it didn't seem that way. And I bet you have made a decision. You have entered into a relationship. You have made a financial investment that on the outlook, in the beginning, you're like, man, this is the thing we need to do. This is the thing that I feel like God's calling us to do. Or this is a good decision that we need to make. Going on that trip or that vacation or whatever. But in the middle of it, when your financial investment doesn't take off the way you thought, the relationship gets kind of murky and difficult, and your differences come out, the new job, everything that you were promised, the grass wasn't actually greener on the other side, or you're on this amazing trip of a lifetime and your plane gets delayed and it gets delayed again, and now you're sleeping on the floor of an airport, or any type of thing like that. In the middle of something, it's oftentimes less promising than we thought it was going to be on the front end, and then we just want to bail. We want to say, call an audible, I'm out of here, see ya, I'm done, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Well, today there are 3 guys that we're going to look at, and these 3 men made a decision on the front end to defy a king's orders, and they were convicted on the front end, and then they were faced with the pressure of what do we do when in the middle is not as ideal as we thought it was going to be? What are we going to do when the consequences of our decision putting pressure on our lives, and how do we respond? And I think that it's something that's very relevant. And we're going to talk about three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They have great names, first of all. Phenomenal names, but they were Jewish people, Israelites, living in a foreign land in Egypt under King Nebuchadnezzar. So let me give you a little bit of history here. The people of God had been captured by the Babylonians. The people of Israel were living in a foreign land, and so they were having to be surrounded by beliefs, customs, traditions that were not their own, that were foreign to them. And so God had commanded his people to live a certain way, but the political and the societal pressures that they lived under forced them to live, or try to put pressure on them to live a different way. One of the things we see early on in the book of Daniel is that King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. It was an idol, and it was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. So this is a pretty big statue. And what we see is that Nebuchadnezzar's intentions were that everyone would worship this idol. And if they did, they would be fine. If they did not, then what awaited them was a fiery furnace. Of course, the Jewish people are in Babylon, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Jewish people, and this was forbidden, because the second of the 10 commandments says this: you shall not make for yourself carved images, and you shall not bow down to them or serve them. And so here we find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in a foreign land, having to deal with all of these types of pressures and having to make a decision, knowing that if we make the decision not to bow and we get caught, a fiery furnace awaits. And that's a lot of pressure to live under. So Daniel 3, starting in verse 13, that's where we're going to pick up the story. The Nebuchadnezzar is furious rage commanded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be brought. So they made the decision, we're not going to bow. They did not bow, and so now Nebuchadnezzar's angry with them, and he has summoned them. So they brought these men before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" So Nebuchadnezzar is angry because he wants them to bow and worship his God and bow and worship him. And so he comes and puts some pressure on them. Pressure that is in the form of political. So, hey, here's what your government is asking you to do. Societal. Here's what the Babylonian society is asking you to do and expecting of you. But then it's also a theological pressure of saying, this is what your God said. Don't worship any other God. But I'm telling you that I'm calling you to worship this God and to worship me ultimately. And so these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had pressures. And guess what? Those are the similar pressures that we find ourselves fighting today. There are political pressures. You just got through with it. COVID. You can talk about we should mask or we shouldn't mask, but in the middle of that, people felt pressure. You want to talk about why there's so much crazy stuff happening and over the last couple of years? Because people were pressured in a way that we have not seen before, and what's inside of them comes out, because that's what happens. When you get squeezed, whatever's inside of you comes out. And so people were then mandated to do this and told they needed to do this, but we live in a free country, but the government's saying this, but then the government might be wrong or they might be right. And everybody went crazy, right? So there's political pressure. We see societal pressure. No matter what side of the aisle you fall on, there are societal pressures. On one side, people are trying to take your rights and steal democracy and steal elections. On the other side, we're being asked to be conformed to some secularized, crazy worldview that just allows anything and everything to happen. There's pressure there. You feel it on either side. And then, of course, all of those trickle down to a theological pressure that we have to come to grips with. What do we really believe? And why do we really believe it? And now the church is being forced, or people who follow Jesus, or people thinking about following Jesus, are now having to come to grips and provide answers that society has traditionally taken, but now we're having to go deeper, and we're having to dig deeper on things like sexuality and gender and government roles in our life and all those types of things. And the church is having theologically to wrestle with these and come up with more defined answers. I say all of that not to try to lean one way or the other, but to let you know that the same political, social, and theological issues, pressures that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego face, we face today. And so when we ask the question, how do we respond under pressure? It's an extremely relevant question to ask because it's applicable today. And I'm just thinking it's going to be applicable down the road. Weeks from now, months from now, years from now. And so that's where we find ourselves. And that's where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego found themselves face to face with the king of Babylon saying, if you don't do what I ask you to do, this is what's going to happen. But in the back of their mind saying, but God commanded us to do this, and so we got to figure out what we're going to do. And so Daniel 3:16-18, and this is how they respond. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So what do we do when we face pressure? We embrace the fire. I mean, that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decided to do. They knew the fiery furnace was waiting for them. And they made a decision and said, yeah, even though you threaten us with that, even though we know what our destiny is going to be, we are going to place our trust in the Lord to deliver us from the king and from the furnace, because we believe if we stand on those principles, God is never going to leave us nor forsake us. And so what did they say? They said, fine, bring it on. We embrace the fire. And I believe that this is a true statement. When we embrace the fire, we embrace our purpose. Because a lot of times when we're talking about what our purpose in life is, we oftentimes have to walk through the fire to be refined, and then people can see that purpose, and we can see that purpose or experience that purpose, live out that purpose on the other side. Because here's the thing, you and I don't think we know anything else about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego outside of the fact that they went into a furnace with 3 and there were 4 men in it and they survived. I don't know anything else about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know of anybody else that knows anything else about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There might be some stuff, but that's pretty much what we know about them. So this story is like the purpose for their life, because their life served a bigger purpose than this story. And I think that's something that we have to understand, is that our lives serve a bigger purpose than the story or the circumstances that we find ourselves in the moment, in the middle, when we're tired and we don't want to move forward, or we're threatened, or we just, I don't know if I want to do that. Our lives serve a bigger purpose. And here's the thing. This story tells us everything we need to know about why we exist and what our purpose is. If you slide down a little bit in Daniel, what you will find is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are put into the furnace. And the king is watching, and everybody's watching, and all of a sudden he looks and he says, wait a second, number one, there's not just 3 people in there. Number one, there's not just 3 people in there. There's 4. There's another person. We didn't put another person in there. Now there's 4. And not only that, but they're walking around. They're not even being consumed. And so God's power is on display right in front of King Nebuchadnezzar and everybody else, which is incredible. And this is what happens, Daniel 3, 27 through 30. And the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power on the bodies of those men. The hair of their head was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and there was no smell of fire had come upon them. And Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. So Nebuchadnezzar didn't do away with his sadistic side, okay? And their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So when we embrace the fire, we embrace our purpose. So what was their purpose? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lived in a way that displayed faith in God, expected the power of God, so that others would worship God. That's it. They lived their life in a way that displayed faith in God. They went in it talking to the king of Babylon and saying, you know what? We know what awaits us, but we have faith in our God to deliver us from the circumstances. So they live in a way that displayed faith in God. They expected on the front end the power of God to work. And guess what? So that others would see the power of God and worship him. And that's exactly what happened. King Nebuchadnezzar saw the power of God in the midst of the flames. And he came out and he's like, hey, anybody that harms the people who believe in the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're not having that, because this God clearly is powerful. And that's the greater purpose. That's the greater story that our lives are supposed to tell, is showing people and displaying the power of God in and through our life, so that why? Other people might worship him. That's it. Because more people are going to see how you live, but then by what you say. And if what we say is inconsistent with how we live, that's going to be a problem. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego put their money where their mouth was. They lived in a way they expected God to move, to see the power of God so that other people would worship God. And that's exactly what happened. So let me give you about 4 principles from the story real quick. First is we are to live by faith. Scripture tells us without faith it is impossible to please God. So we walk by faith, not by sight. Even when the governing powers of the world and science and all those kind of things say to us, oh, this is not going to work, this is not going to pan out. We walk by faith and not by sight. It may not look great, but we know God can be with us. The second thing is that we entrust ourselves to God. You are his. I am his. Act out your identity as a child of God, believing he's going to be with you, expecting him to be with you, and allowing his power to be displayed through you. Third thing, live like God is with you. He has promised us that he will be with us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego expected God to be with them. So live like God is with us. We don't have to go to some place to enter the presence of God. Jesus said there's going to come a day when nobody worships on this mountain or that mountain, but they're going to worship in spirit and in truth. God is with you all the time. He's given you, if you've received him and you're a child of God, you have the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is with you all of the time. One of the things we tell our boys if they get scared, we say, you know what? Jesus never sleeps. He's always with you. He never goes to sleep. He never leaves you. He's always with you. We got to start living like God is with us. And the other thing is, look for God's power to be displayed. Look for God's power to be displayed. Develop a habit and look for God's power in the little and in the big things. Sometimes God's power is displayed in just a little thing. Sometimes his favor is displayed in just a little thing. So look for it. Be aware. Acknowledge it and thank him for it. But we What do we do when we live under all these pressures? We live in a way that displays faith in God, expects the power of God, so that others will worship God. Because here's the thing, when we embrace the fire, we embrace our purpose. The point is this, is that the fire is coming. It doesn't matter what life you live, what stage of life you're in, the fire is coming. And it's kind of like hiking Mount Evans. You know, middle way through, you're kind of like, man, I don't really want to push through this. I really don't want to do this. I don't want to get cut up by any more willows. My socks are now wet. You know, I'm just really tired of going off trail and trying to look for things or whatever. But you know what? When we pushed through and we came back and we got in our car, man, it was one of the best adventures we'd ever had hiking. It's still like in my top 3 favorite hikes because it just meant a little bit more. It took a little bit more to do what we needed to do, right? It wasn't just follow this trail, walk up or climb up and all that kind of stuff. It was adventurous. There was something, and I was like, man, I'm so glad that we pushed through to get to the end. There's some of you guys right now that are embracing the fire. There might be some of you that are listening right now and you have never been to church, you haven't been to church in a long time, and you are embracing the fire. And here's the thing. When you're facing the fire, we got to embrace it. And we got to live a life that expects God to be with us, to expect the power of God to be shown through us so that others may worship God. I believe that God's taking you through the fire right now so that your friends and your family members and your neighbors can see God's power displayed through you. And you know what? That is a phenomenal testimony to the power and the faithfulness of God, not only in your life, but what it can mean for others' lives. So I encourage you to live out that purpose, embrace the fire, don't quit, don't stop, because when you do that, I truly believe other people see Jesus and see His power, and they see Jesus in and through you, and they will come to know that they need a relationship with Him and are more likely to accept Him as their Lord and Savior. Of course, we would love for you to do that. If you're watching, or if you are in a Harvest home, we'd love to have a conversation like that with you. You can drop a comment in the comments section, or you can talk to your Harvest home leader about that. We look forward to seeing you next time as we start our Christmas series, A Christmas Story. Can't wait for that. God bless you.